Hi, this is Darren Rasmussen speaking. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This one is about the dark side of hypnosis and suggestion. Might be somewhat lengthy, but I really want to go in depth into the dark side of hypnosis. Can hypnosis be used as a form of mind control? Could you create a Manchurian candidate that could, for example, be programmed to kill someone, acting out a post-hypnotic suggestion outside of awareness, for example? Can you use hypnosis to control someone else's mind and make someone do stuff that is deeply against their values? Um, So let's look at this and let's look at the evidence. Let's look at this with some depth. First of all, I would like to offer a definition because very often when people discover or discuss the topic of hypnosis and these types of topics, they're often unwilling to offer a definition. Now, in the same way that medicine, has to make some sort of distinction of what counts as a disease and what counts not as a disease for the word disease to have any function or any agreed upon meaning. We have to do the same thing with hypnosis. So I think that the definition that Herbert Spiegel came up with is the most functional one and likely the most accurate one when it comes to hypnosis. So he defines hypnosis as a state of very aroused, focused attention. And he thinks of hypnosis, and I use this because I agree with it. It matches my own experience. And he thinks of hypnosis as consisting of three phenomena. One is absorption, the ability to get absorbed into a suggested experience to the extent that it's as real as real. So hypnosis here, as we talk about it, has two people. One person offering suggestions, guiding the other person's imagination and emotions. And then you have the subject. So one person's offering the suggestions. So absorption here becomes the ability to become experientially absorbed into a suggested reality, so much so that it's as real as real. That's one of the components. So you could use the example of a movie or a good book where the movie director or the author is kind of like a dream pilot or a director or a hypnotist in quotation marks. If you can get so experientially absorbed into the movie that it's almost as if you're one of the characters, it's all real to you. You're emotionally having the experiences. And afterwards, perhaps you need a few seconds, when the movie's over, you need a few seconds to kind of reorient back into the movie theater to kind of realize where you are. That would be an example of absorption. The other related capacity here is dissociation. So whenever someone talks about, I just found myself doing something, like they don't have the experience that they're the author of the experience, in a sense, you talk about various levels of dissociation. Now, there's a very well-known experiment that's common to do to, demonstrate hypnosis, where you do hypnosis with someone and you give them the suggestion, for example, that when they later come out of hypnosis and you offer some sort of cue, might be pulling your ear, might be mentioning the word hamburger, might be tapping your pen on the paper, on the pencil, or bringing up a certain topic, they will have the compulsion to do something. For example, take off their shoe, or close the window, or leave the room, something like that. And then you offer them the suggestion that they will have complete amnesia for having been given the suggestion, until you later tap them on the shoulder, for example. This is a fun thing to do with a good hypnotic subject, and it really has a tendency to be a showstopper, in the sense that anyone who experiences it as a subject, or experiences it as a spectator, where they know that this person's not faking, the person's really into it. So let's say that you then later on, tug your ear, or you mention the word hamburger, and the person begins to move to close the window. A fun thing to do is to stop the person, prevent the person from doing it, and then watch the compulsory nature of people wanting to close the window, and all the reasons that they may offer for why they have to close the window, and the irritation they often display. And then later on, when you tap them on the shoulder and they suddenly remember the suggestion, the look of relief, surprise, shock, sometimes crying, laughing as hard that they end up crying, these are common experiences. So when this is an example of profound dissociation, meaning people compulsively want to close the window. They're acting on a post-hypnotic suggestion, but they consciously have no access to the fact that they're acting on the suggestion. So their mind invents all these sorts of reasons for why they have to close the window. This is a very, very interesting thing. Now, people like George Estabrooks, who wrote the book Hypnotism, and who wrote about how you could program hypnotic spies and Manchurian candidates and stuff like that. It's an interesting read if you want to pick up George Estabrooks's book Hypnotism. It should be pointed out that he never actually did any of this stuff, even though he really wanted to do this stuff and was really in communication with the U.S. Army during the Second World War of wanting to do these types of experiments. If you're of the conviction that George Estabrooks actually did these things, I invite you to read the book The Letters of Milton H. Erickson, which shows letter correspondence between Estabrooks and Erickson on this very topic during and after the Second World War, and it becomes apparent that Estabrooks never actually did this stuff. But the fact that you can, with a good hypnotic subject, influence people to have these very dissociated experiences, has led a lot of people to think that wait a minute, you could perhaps hypnotize a spy and kind of program information or some cue to assassinate someone into their unconscious mind, give them amnesia, and then tie the assassination to a particular cue, where the person's acting out the assassination as a post-hypnotic suggestion based in hypnotic amnesia. Now, could you do this? This is the really, really interesting question. There was a guy by the name of Jesse Ventura, who an American politician who used to have a TV program called Conspiracy Theory, and he would make the claim that experiments in the hypnosis lab absolutely proved this to be the case. They went to this psychological lab where this guy was hypnotized really deeply, and giving them the suggestion that whenever some cue, can't remember what it was, some sort of sound, some sort of visual input in his environment would happen, that he would be unable to move, and that he would have complete amnesia for the suggestion. Now, during the TV show, you actually see this happening. You see that the guy's walking around, the cue gets fired off, and he's completely frozen, and he's distressed and genuinely unable to move. Now, people without hypnosis training and some hypnotists as well will use experiments like this on the stage, in the lab, even in the therapy office, as evidence that you could do hypnotic mind control, or you could, create a hypnotic spy, or a Manchurian candidate, or something to that effect. Darren Brown, the world famous mentalist, had a TV show that he called The Assassin a few years ago, where he hypnotically trained a person to assassinate, I think it was Stephen Fry, at least a famous person. I think it was Stephen Fry, based upon memory, but I can't quite remember. Stephen Fry being not the hypnotic subject, but the subject of assassination. And so this guy actually ended up in a theater, receiving some sort of cue, and then he shot Stephen Fry. Of course, surprise, surprise, the gun wasn't loaded. But this has, by many people, again, been used as some sort of proof that you could hypnotically train a spy. Well, could you? I think not. I very deeply suspect not, I should say. And the reason I say that, I don't claim it with 100% certainty, is because I've never really done the experiments. I've never tried to create a hypnotic spy or some sort of assassin. So I can't with 100% certainty say that, you couldn't. But I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that these claims don't really hold up in the real world. So let's start with some pretty, I think, elementary logic for these claims. First of all, any therapist, any hypnotherapist worth his salt, meaning anyone who has tons of experience and some ability to learn from that experience, will confirm the following to you. This is an empirical fact that is undisputable. And that is, you can have marvelous hypnotic subjects in your therapy office who can do, post-hypnotic suggestions with an amnesia condition. They can do positive and negative hallucinations. They can do all the stuff. They're profound hypnotic subjects. You can have a client like that who still, in reality, won't even make the most basic change that he's paid you to help you make him or her change. So I have had people who have paid me good money to help them stop smoking, who, at least on a conscious level, on many levels, have been motivated to stop smoking, who have been motivated enough to do pre-tasks, to pay money, to travel to come to my office, who seem congruent on many levels of wanting to make the change. The people in their environment, their wife, their kids, want them to make the change. Society around them wants to make the change. Quitting smoking is congruent with their verbally stated values of wanting to be around for their kids and their grandkids and their health and so on and so forth. In addition, they're excellent hypnotic subjects who can act out post-hypnotic suggestions with a amnesia condition. And despite this, on occasion, embarrassingly enough, depending upon your beliefs, you will have the experience of people like that not even then quitting smoking. This is true. Anyone worth his salt will admit to that. So, what to make of this? Anyone who's willing to be remotely honest with you will admit to you that change work can, on occasion, be extremely hard. Will admit to you that sometimes people don't change at all. Some clients, you can have all the skill in the world. You can know pretty much what there is to know about hypnosis. I'll put that in quotation marks, but you can really do your best, and you can have great hypnotic subjects who then don't make a change. A change that they are on many levels invested in, that society around them wants them to make, that seems congruent with their values. So I think we have to acknowledge that helping people make changes that they voluntarily want to make and are willing to pay for with time and money, that seems congruent with their values and their social surround, that these types of changes can often be hard enough to help people change. And sometimes, unfortunately, people don't change at all. So if you grant this and you acknowledge this, if you then want to use the fact that people can act out post-hypnotic suggestions with a amnesia condition as evidence that people could be programmed to do stuff that's completely against their own stated values, motives, interests, the interest of their family, their social surround, and especially that someone's going to act this out as some sort of spy, 6 months later or 12 months later. Well, I think that's a level of optimism or faith that really is uncalled for. Milton Erickson, back in the day, used to do a lot of experiments with antisocial behavior, hypnotizing people to steal in the local store and stuff like that. And he did quite a few of these types of experiments. And what he discovered was that the people who stole in hypnosis were the same people who stole outside of hypnosis. So that's an interesting thing. There's a guy called, it's either John Marks or Spencer Marks. It's a book titled The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. It's a well-written book. I recommend it if you're interested in this type of topic. It was about the MK Ultra program, which was partially about attempting to create hypnotic spies and stuff like that. Based upon the Freedom of Information Act, Marx was able to dig out, I think it was 15,000 pages of documents, on this stuff, that really showed that hypnosis was way too unstable a tool to really have any reliable use in the context of training a spy or an assassin or a good soldier. Now, the conspiracy theorists will, of course, say that the real documents are somewhere else or something like that. All I can say is, that this matches the experience of the clinician. If you talk to people who are willing to admit that there are degrees of hypnotic capacity that vary in people. This is my observation. It's the observation of a lot of other people. I mentioned Steven Spiegel. You can check out Dabney Ewan's work, for examples of this. A observation is that they have made, and which I have made, is that more often than not, it's the highly hypnotizable client who comes back to either the office or the hospital, months later with the same recurring symptoms. And there is a trick in working with people with very high hypnotizability, and that is that the changes can be very easy come, easy go. Meaning, you do hypnosis with someone, they accept some sort of suggestion, and they go out into the world. But the problem is, you're not the only hypnotist. This ability for absorption and dissociation, and suggestibility. That's the third kind of factor. Suggestibility is the ability to kind of have the experience of non-voluntarily just responding to a suggestion. So an example I like to use, I worked with a guy once, 13-year-old kid who was very allergic, who I suggested was having the allergic responses as a result of suggestion, specifically his mother. So he was in my office, and I said to him, you know, if your mother was here right now, Richard, and she asked you, can you feel your allergy coming on? Can you feel that, Richard? And I nodded my head, and he produced the symptoms in his nose and the running of his eyes. That's suggestibility, in that sense. So anyways, easy come, easy go. Someone might act out some sort of suggestion, but then they go back into the world. And this tendency to, especially during conflict, become automatically absorbed into suggestions, you know, to experience it in a very dissociated way and in a non-volitional way. The people who are highly hypnotizable very often do this in other contexts as well. So, you know, they go back into their family environment. They go back to see their physician, for example, and their physician might say, you know, hypnosis is a bunch of bunk. You know, you have just as much pain as you've always had. You're just as sick and just as ill as you've always been. And now, you know, they act out these suggestions in these contexts. This is one issue with people who are very, very hypnotizable. So given the instability of attempting to just use suggestion as the vehicle, you know, banking on the idea that someone will act out these sorts of suggestions in some context 3 or 6 months later, that might be very stressful, where there might be very competing contexts with various cues, I think is rather foolhardy. Now, let's go back to the Darren Brown experiment. Did he prove that since his subject stood up and shot Stephen Fry with the non-loaded gun, that you could create a hypnotic assassin? No, not with some clear thinking. Because look at the context. Everyone in Britain, you know, that signs up for the show knows that Darren Brown is a mentalist. They know that mentalism and the show is about trickery and deception. You know, I would imagine anyone who signs up for the program knows that the gun isn't really loaded. Like, they know that in the back of their head. If they're halfway rational, they know that there's no chance in hell that Darren Brown as a TV performer and the BBC or whoever produced it would ever in a million years risk giving someone a loaded gun on TV to shoot an innocent person as a part of a TV experiment, and all the legal risks that would ensue. You know, so this person, even though hypnotized, was acting out the role of a reality TV participant as he understood the role. In the same way of the lab, you know, people unconsciously and automatically act out the role of the hypnotic subject in accordance with how they understand the role in that particular context. Change the context, and all bets are off. So to really appreciate the relevancy and the importance of context is crucial if you're going to do some clear thinking on these particular topics. So, but I'd like to offer for you something that I think is a great example of the dark side of hypnosis. It's somewhat debatable whether to call this the effect of hypnosis or not. I'm going to make an argument for why I think it is appropriate to call this hypnosis. Now, before we go into that particular story, I want to bring up a very quick tool, pacing and leading. And I'll first show you a good way, an ethical way to use pacing and leading. And then I'll show you how it can be done and has been done and is being done to often create a context where people will act out post-hypnotic suggestions in a way that's quite detrimental. So, and Milton Erickson, again, who was really the guy who pioneered and systematized the use of pacing and leading. So the idea here is to build up a yes set. You say things that the other person can verify as true in their direct experience, and then after building a yes set, you begin to offer suggestions. It's kind of based on the idea that for someone to accept you as an authority of where they should go, they have to first accept you as an authority of where they currently are in their own experience. So let's say that you get a client into your office who's really withdrawn and seems very closed and who doesn't really reveal or offer anything, who's really, really guarded. How could you use pacing and leading to help this person open up more, to become more engaged and to become more open? Well, this is a kind of Ericksonian way of doing it. So you might start by offering some suggestions or observations, some claims that the person can verify in his experience. So let's say that this is the first session. So you might say to the person, this is our first session together. You don't know me, I don't know you, we don't really know each other yet. Now, these are all factual claims. If it is the first session, this is our first session, yes. You don't really know me, yes. I don't know you, yes. We don't really know each other yet, presupposing that we will. That's a little presupposition there at the end. So you're building a yes set. Now, I'm going to be asking you some questions. This is something that the person will be able to verify in his own experience. You're talking sense. And then you might say, and when I ask you these questions, I want you to maintain the right to withhold information 100%. And to only share the stuff that you want to share. And you can share what you want to share as freely as you want. Now, what are you doing here? Well, you're pacing the person's reality. You're telling the person, I see where you're at. I grant where you're at. I give you permission to be where you're at. You're even telling the person to maintain the right to withhold information. And then you're offering suggestions about, and to only share what you want to share. That's the embedded suggestion. You want to share. You go down in your tonality. You nod your head. You want to share, and you can share as freely as you want. You're emphasizing freely by marketing out. So is this guaranteed to work? No, not at all. But I have on many occasions had the experience of people loosening up when doing this type of pacing and leading. So here's how not to do it. And what I would argue is one example of the dark side of hypnosis and suggestion. When my wife gave birth to our daughter, we were in the hospital, of course, And well, not of course, not everybody is, but we were. And at this particular hospital, there's this routine that the day after the birth, the head nurse, I called her the Norwegian nurse Ratched, you know, based upon the character and the old Jack Nicholson movie back in the 70s, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Anyways, there's this tradition that they come into the room and they have a conversation, very innocent conversation, an informative conversation with the parents. So she comes into the room, she says, congratulations, starts off with some kind of social banter, and then she offers a bunch of pacing statements, this is your first child, it's correct, this is a new situation for the both of you. You likely have questions and ideas. Life is about to become quite different for you in ways you have expected and perhaps also in ways that you haven't quite expected. So these are all statements that we can kind of verify as factual in our own experience. So she offers, and this woman has no training in hypnosis whatsoever, but she offers all these pacing statements, and then after having established a very solid yes set, she offers the following suggestions. Now, about 80% of the new mothers have a nervous breakdown within a day or two. They're crying out into the hallway. And that's okay. It's very important to just let that happen. This is what she told my wife. And then she started offering direct suggestions of how you will become anxious, and you'll be irritable, and you'll be depressed, and you're going to feel this, and you're going to feel that. And she even starts to offer kind of post-hypnotic suggestions that, for example, you might find yourself doing stuff that's completely unreasonable. Maybe mother-in-law shows up and says this and this, and you just find yourself exploding into a rage. Now notice this, find yourself non-voluntarily. It's just going to happen in a dissociative way. So at this point, I'd heard enough of this madness. So I said, excuse me, does she have to become depressed? Like, is it mandatory that she fly into a rage if my mother says this or that? Does everyone do this? Does she have to? And now Nurse Ratched had to confess that no, she doesn't have to. No, she doesn't really have to. No, she doesn't really have to. So we kind of, picked the whole thing apart. And I went out. Later on, I went out in the hallway and I met her and I said, I introduced myself. And I offered some ideas and some objections. I don't think she really heard me. She was kind of polite, but just one of these people who seemed completely indoctrinated into the system that she was part of and had no training in hypnosis or suggestion. I asked her, do you tell all the mothers that 80% of the new mothers have a breakdown on the first or second day after the birth? She said, oh yeah, it's very important that they know that. I'm giving them accurate information. Now, of course, if you have new mothers, they might be, vulnerable. They might be slightly scared. If they look at the head nurse as an authority figure on what's supposed to happen, and they accept the suggestion, they kind of unconsciously begin to expect that that's part of being a new mother. Part of being a new mother is to have this freak out and to have it happen non-voluntarily. Then if you know anything about suggestion and expectancy, you know that by stating this, you're dramatically increasing the number of people who will have such a breakdown. You're not just conveying information, you're offering suggestions for how people are to engage in and act out the role of new mother in accordance with how they understand the role. Understanding the role as directed by the head nurse. So by doing this, and of course offering the suggestions that people will become depressed and that they'll fly into rage, and linking that to various contexts, this woman thinks she's just giving people an informative talk. What she really is doing is creating a context where it's likely that a lot more people will have those experiences where in fact many of them wouldn't, hadn't it been for that conversation. Now, here's why I'm um, labeling this as likely hypnotic. I'm labeling it as likely hypnotic due to when people then, have the nervous breakdown in the hallway, it's likely experienced as a completely non-volitional experience. And in the same way as, well, not quite the same way, but in a similar way to the people who have the compulsion to open the door and who can't trace the kind of origin of that idea being the post-hypnotic suggestion. When people later on fly into a rage or have the nervous breakdown or fly into a rage when mother-in-law shows up or whatever the context might be, when they then later kind of rationalize to themselves, why did I do that? And they come up with explanations, it's likely the explanations they come up with are likely to be completely dissociated from the fact that they're acting on a suggestion. They're likely to make up reasons that fit within how most people in this culture make sense of things. So it was fatigue, it's hormones, it's sleep deprivation, and all of these things might be relevant factors. I'm not saying that these things might not be relevant factors. I'm just saying that very few, if any, people are likely to trace that behavior back to that particular suggestion that they in fact were given. And this, in my view at least, other people even with training might disagree, but this, in my view at least, makes it very, very likely, or makes the interpretation very plausible that these are hypnotic responses. So this I would say is an excellent example of the dark side of hypnosis. Now here's the really sad part. With some training, with some understanding, she could have had those conversations in a way where she could have really empowered the new mothers, where she could have really created a context where it would be much less likely that people suffered unnecessarily, and also much more likely that people would deal with it in a way more productive way. How could she do this, even if she felt compelled to give information? Well, she might have said, well, on occasion, some people might experience X, and there are people sometimes who might experience Y. Now, she might have pointed away when talking about these things. She might have used a tonality of doubt. Some people do become a bit anxious. I mean, it can happen to some people. When you use your voice tone in that way, you're kind of implying that it's not really going to happen to you. It's not really likely to happen. Then you could have said, and then there are many people who find that they're quite calm, and where people can find that you're in touch with your resources. You're able to deal with this in a way that really, really works. She could have used a command tone when giving those types of suggestions. It's a bit like in the medical context. If you're a medical doctor and you prescribe certain medications, and let's say that the law requires you to talk about the potential side benefits, you can have a little talk with the patients that dramatically reduce the chances of side effects, and where you can link side effects to them being in touch with their resources. So you might say, well, on occasion, some patients might become nauseous, and then you have other people who might experience X or Y. These things may happen to some people some of the time, but other people find that you're quite comfortable through this process. But if you were to feel nauseous, as you feel that, you can know that that means that the medication is working. And it's working towards helping you being back on your bike, really enjoying those biking trips in the mountains, feeling the fresh air, really being at your best. And every time you might feel that nauseousness, you know that the meds are working, and you know that you are on your way back to your bike. And you can really become absorbed into that, feel that, look forward to that. So in this case, you might use suggestions that the nausea, for example, the side effect means that the medication is working, and that means that they're on their way back to their bike, feeling the fresh mountain air. Of course, I'm assuming here that the patient is a person who likes biking, for example. If not, you might use something else from the person's life. Might be playing with their kids again, if you were to feel this, you can know that this means that the medications are working, and you're on your way back to playing with your grandchildren and really being with them, and really enjoying it. Seeing those laughs, seeing those smiles, really being connected with them in the way you used to be. You can really look forward to that. You can link these together by suggestion and help create a very, very different experience. I'd like to bring up a final point here. I'll create a part 2 for this dark side thing. I think it's very important to differentiate between obedience and suggestibility. So obedience essentially being doing what you're told, and suggestibility and dissociation absorption having to do with the experience of non-voluntarily kind of finding yourself doing something or experiencing something. It's quite different. So a lot of people will use, for example, Salomon Asch's research on conformity and obedience. You have a famous one where you have a test subject who gets shown 2 lines, where one line is clearly longer than the other, and then he gets put into a room with 9 other people who are actors, but the subject doesn't know this, and other people are being asked, which line is the longest, and all the other people pick the wrong line. And you see, if I remember correctly, that in like 70% of the cases, something like that, the subject will now pick the line that they know to be the shortest as the longest one, due to the kind of social pressure in the social situation. People use the Stanley Milgram experiments, where about 65% of people were willing to kill and torture the other person behind the glass wall, who was not really connected and feeling pain, but an actor who pretended to be, but they didn't know this. You can look out the Stanley Milgram obedience experiments. I'm not going to cover it in detail here, but this shocked the hell out of psychiatrists and psychologists. When Milgram asked psychiatrists and psychologists before the experiments, how many people do you think I can get to torture and kill the other person? They would say like 1, 2, 3%. The psychopaths, the sadists, turn out to be about 65%. People would often be crying, I don't want to do this. This is horrible, while they were torturing the other person. And of course, the person in the white coat would say the experiment demands that you complete it or continue, and then people would comply. Or you have the Zimbardo prison experiment, where healthy, students, some people were prison guards, other people were inmates in this made-up prison for a couple of weeks, and they had to abort the whole thing after a few days because the prison guards were really mistreating the others, you know, acting as these sadistic pricks. Now, this shows, unfortunately, the tendencies towards obedience and conformity in way too many of us, which is scary. But it really has little to do with hypnosis. These experiments are not in any way, shape, or form proof that you could create a hypnotic Manchurian candidate. I can't claim this with certainty because I haven't done the experiments, but I'm relatively sure that if you had done hypnosis prior to the Milgram experiment or the Stanford experiment, I would predict, and I may be wrong, so take this with a huge grain of salt, but I would predict that way less people would have carried out those grotesque acts if they had been hypnotized to do so. Why do I think this? Well, consider the kind of meta-suggestion at play. If you're going to do something like this and you hypnotize someone, you give them suggestions, you create this whole ritual, you're kind of implying or suggesting that this is out of the ordinary, that we're going to ask you to do stuff that you otherwise might not do. We need this tool of hypnosis to get you to do it, you know. But if you just imply it, if you just have the authority figure, you know, with the white coat, you have the lab, you just act as if this is the most natural thing in the world, well, then a lot of people, unfortunately, will just comply, which is what Milgram found. He found good Nazis or good Germans everywhere, even everywhere in the United States and all across Europe. So, I hope this was interesting. It's a topic worth exploring. It's a topic worth it's a topic worth sharing. I'll offer this finally, and that is that, you know, none of us really know what might lie dormant in the deep psyche or unconscious of another human being. We don't really have access to our own unconscious processes, and we don't really have access to other people's unconscious processes. So you know, I'll offer the example of Kenneth Parks, who was by all means a completely normal guy. He was actually trying to do something in politics a few years ago, but had to kind of abort his campaign when the story leaked that 25 years earlier, I think this was back in 1987, I might be mistaken, but just going by memory here, Kenneth Parks was a regular guy who fell asleep in front of the television set one night, and then allegedly, while asleep, drove to his parents-in-law's house, you know, took a huge hammer, went in there, killed his mother-in-law, seriously wounded his father-in-law, who was able to escape, then drove himself to the police station, you know, bloodied, and said, you know, I think I just killed someone. Now, this seemed like a slam dunk case for the prosecution, just, you know, manslaughter or, you know, homicide. But he was sent to these sleep laboratories where a bunch of sleep researchers who initially were very skeptical to his story concluded. I don't know enough about sleep to really offer much here, but they all concluded that most likely this had all been done unconsciously, like a somnambulist, that he had done this completely in his sleep. So he was acquitted. Acquitted of the crime and has not killed anyone or hurt anyone since. Really interesting factor too is that he has allegedly never been violent in his life. He had a very good relationship to his parents-in-law. There's no big conflicts, nothing going on. So it's a kind of chilling example of you know, the types of impulses and acts that people might be capable of that might be completely out of character. So you don't really know. You don't really know what might lie dormant in yourself or someone else, and who knows what contextual triggers or whatever might remind someone to to do something. So anyways, I'll hope you will follow part 2 in a couple of days. If you have any comments, objections, interesting ideas, insights, feel free to post them wherever you find this particular video. Till next time, sleep well.